Caleb wore the brand of cowardice like a second skin, a title burned into him one terrible night when the raiders came, and he had run. In a town that valued grit above all else, his name was a synonym for shame. Leanne, on the other hand, was defined by the stillness of her body. A fever in her youth had stolen the use of her legs, and in the eyes of the world, and even her own merchant father, she was a beautiful, broken doll, a ledger of debits with a sharp mind no one cared to read. Their union was a masterpiece of cruelty, orchestrated by Marcus Thorne, a man whose wealth was matched only by his malice. As a twisted wedding gift for some insignificant debt Caleb owed, Thorne delivered Leanne to Caleb's dilapidated homestead in a rough-hewn wagon, her ornate but useless wheelchair a stark mockery of her situation. A broken man for a broken woman, Thorne had announced to the laughing crowd he'd assembled. Let's see what kind of life they can build together. He saw only two discarded things, a coward and a cripple, and he had yoked them together for his own amusement. But would they, the town's cast-offs, realize too late that Marcus Thorne had just created the most dangerous partnership his corrupt world had ever known? Their first night as husband and wife was shrouded in a silence as vast and empty as the prairie outside their cabin. Leanne sat in her chair, her back ramrod straight, her expression a mask of impenetrable pride. Caleb stood by the cold hearth, the weight of his own shame and now this new, imposed responsibility pressing down on him until he could barely breathe. He saw the fury and fear warring in her dark eyes and felt a pang of something other than self-pity. He saw a person, trapped not just in her chair, but in this cruel farce. Without a word, he picked up his tools and a few spare planks of wood. He worked through the night by the light of a single lantern, the scrape of his plane and the soft tap of his hammer the only sounds. By dawn, a sturdy, smooth ramp led from the cabin floor to the hard-packed earth outside. It was a simple thing, but it was an acknowledgement. It was a bridge. He didn't offer her pity or empty words of comfort, he offered her access. He offered her a small piece of the world back. Leanne watched him, her intelligent gaze missing nothing, the skill in his hands, the deep-seated sorrow in his shoulders. She had been prepared for a brute or a fool. She hadn't been prepared for a man who spoke the language of building, a man who saw a problem and simply, quietly, fixed it. In that silent, shared space, an unspoken pact began to form. He would be her hands and legs, she would be the architect he never knew he needed. The land around their cabin was stubborn and unforgiving, yielding little more than dust and disappointment. Caleb's attempts at farming were a testament to futility, each withered sprout a fresh indictment of his failure. They were starving, slowly and quietly. One evening, as Caleb stared blankly at their dwindling supply of flour, Leanne broke the silence that had governed their lives. "This land will not feed us," she stated, her voice clear and steady, devoid of accusation. "But it can provide," she gestured with her chin toward the window, where the main wagon trail cut a dusty scar across the horizon. "The trail provides. Wagons break. Axles snap. Horses need shoeing. Men like Thorne control the main supply lines, but they are slow and expensive. They do not serve the small traveler." She unfurled a piece of parchment on which she had drawn a detailed layout, her hand moving with practiced precision. "Here," she said, pointing to a spot near the trail. "You will build a smithy. Small, efficient. We will offer fast, reliable repairs. We will not be farmers, Caleb. We will be mechanics. We will be merchants of necessity." Caleb looked from the drawing to her face, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. The idea was audacious. It required a different kind of strength, a different kind of courage. He looked at his calloused hands, hands that knew how to shape wood and stone, and then at her, the strategist confined to a chair. For the first time since he had been branded a coward, a sliver of hope, sharp and unfamiliar, pierced through his despair. He had nothing left to lose. He nodded once. "I'll start tomorrow." The construction of the forge became Caleb's penance and his purpose. He worked from sunup to sundown, the rhythmic clang of his hammer a defiant heartbeat against the town's mocking silence. He built with a meticulous care that bordered on reverence, each joint perfect, each beam secure. Leanne, from the shade of the porch, was the silent commander of their small enterprise. Her mind, so long dismissed, was a finely tuned engine of logistics. She directed Caleb to trade their last few scrawny chickens for a bellows and an anvil from a homesteader moving back east. She produced a ledger, and with elegant, precise script, began to track every nail, every plank, every potential expense and source of income. When the forge was complete, a modest but solid structure, she instructed him on what signs to post and what prices to set, having spent weeks observing the traffic on the trail and deducing its needs. Their first customers were wary, but Caleb's work was honest and strong, and Leanne's pricing was fair. Word began to spread. Marcus Thorne and his cronies would ride by, their laughter ringing with contempt. "The coward's forge," they jeer. "Run by the broken doll." The insults were meant to sting, to tear them down, but they had an unintended effect. Each jeer was like a hammer blow on hot iron, forging Caleb and Leanne's silent partnership into something harder, something more resilient. They were no longer just a man and a woman, they were a functioning unit, their shared purpose a shield against the world's contempt. One dusty afternoon, 3 rough-looking drifters, drawn by the scent of a nascent, unprotected prosperity, rode up to the forge. Their leader, a man with a jagged scar across his face, dismounted and swaggered toward Caleb. "Heard you do good work," he snarled, his eyes roaming over their small stock of tools and iron. "We'll be taking our payment in advance." Caleb's blood ran cold. The familiar, paralyzing fear seized him, rooting his feet to the ground. The memory of the raid, of his own shameful flight, flooded his mind. He was frozen, a coward once again. But then, a small sound from the cabin porch, the creak of Leanne's wheelchair as she shifted, broke the spell. He glanced over and saw not fear in her eyes, but a cold, calculating fury. The sight of her, so fierce and so vulnerable, ignited a new and unfamiliar fire within him. This was his home. She was his partner. He would not run. He didn't reach for a gun or raise his fists. Instead, with a sudden, desperate lunge, he kicked the support holding a heavy rack of iron bars. The bars crashed down, blocking the doorway and startling the drifters' horses. In the ensuing chaos, he grabbed a red-hot horseshoe from the coals with a pair of long tongs and advanced, the glowing iron a terrifying weapon. The men, expecting a simple robbery, not this display of desperate, intelligent ferocity, scrambled back onto their spooked horses and fled. Caleb stood there, chest heaving, the hot tongs trembling in his hand. He hadn't fought with bravado. He had fought to protect. And in that moment, he felt the first crack in the shameful brand that had defined his life. The story of Caleb's defense of the forge spread through the town, twisting the narrative that Thorne had so carefully crafted. The coward had faced down 3 armed men. Thorne, whose power relied on the perception of his own unchallenged dominance, was incensed. The success of Caleb and Leanne was more than an annoyance, it was an affront. Their small, thriving business was a symbol of defiance that he could not tolerate. He decided to crush them, not with overt violence, but with the slow, grinding power of his economic influence. He began his assault by leaning on the freight company that delivered their coal, threatening to pull his own lucrative contracts unless they cut off the forge. Within a week, their supply of fuel, the very lifeblood of their business, dried up. Caleb was devastated. "It's over," he said, slumping onto a crate, the fight draining out of him. His one Leanne, however, was not defeated. She wheeled herself over to a dusty crate in the corner of the cabin, from which she produced a set of old, rolled-up surveyor's maps she had traded for weeks ago. She unrolled one, her finger tracing a series of faint contour lines on the hills behind their property. "When my father first came here, he commissioned a geological survey," she explained, her voice calm and resolute. "He was looking for gold. He found none. But the surveyor noted something else. A shallow seam of coal. Too small for a large-scale mining operation, but more than enough for us." Thorne thought he had cut off their lifeline, but he had merely forced them to dig their own. He had underestimated his opponent. He thought he was fighting a blacksmith, he had no idea he was at war with a general. The discovery of the coal seam was a turning point. Caleb worked tirelessly, digging the fuel from their own land, a physical manifestation of their self-sufficiency. The forge was not just running again, it was thriving. Leanne, no longer content to simply react to Thorne, went on the offensive. She saw that the Stagecoach Line, a separate company from Thorne's freight business, often suffered from minor but inconvenient breakdowns that caused delays. She sent a letter to the station master, proposing a formal contract, guaranteed priority repairs for all their coaches at a fixed, reasonable rate. The station master, tired of Thorne's price gouging and poor service for similar work, readily agreed. Their income stabilized and grew. They became an essential part of the town's infrastructure. Thorne's campaign of sabotage had backfired spectacularly. His attempts to isolate them had only made them more resourceful. His efforts to ruin them financially had pushed them to secure a contract that gave them more stability than ever. He was a bully who only understood the brute force of tearing things down. He could not comprehend the patient, resilient strength of building something up. Every time he attacked them, he inadvertently revealed a new weakness in his own empire and a new, unforeseen strength in their partnership. The Cripple's Forge, the town's joke, was becoming its cornerstone, and the so-called broken couple were proving to be the most formidable force in the entire county. Driven to the edge of reason by his repeated failures, Marcus Thorne abandoned all pretense of strategy and resorted to pure, destructive rage. One moonless night, he and two of his hired thugs rode to the homestead, their faces hidden by bandanas, carrying torches that cut jagged holes in the darkness. They doused the walls of the smithy in oil and set it ablaze. The fire caught with a hungry roar, devouring the dry timber in seconds. Caleb was woken by the crackle of flames and the terrified whinny of their horse. He burst out of the cabin and saw their creation, their future, being consumed by a torrent of orange and black. For a horrifying second, he was paralyzed by the scale of the disaster. But then he heard Leanne cry out his name from inside the cabin. His fear for her life eclipsed everything else. He ran back inside, scooped her and her light, wooden chair into his arms in a single, desperate movement, and carried her out to the safety of the open field just as the smithy's roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and embers. He stood there, holding her, as they watched everything they had built turn to ash. Thorne and his men, watching from the shadows, believed they had finally won, that they had broken them completely. But as the flames lit up the night sky, their glow was visible from the town. People began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the terrible spectacle. They saw the smoldering ruins. They saw the man who was once a coward, now standing as a defiant protector. And they saw the woman in the wheelchair, her face streaked with soot but her eyes blazing with an unextinguished fire. The dawn broke on a scene of total devastation. The smithy was a blackened skeleton, the air thick with the smell of char and failure. Caleb and Leanne sat in silence, the rising sun casting long, sorrowful shadows over the ruins of their dream. It felt like the end. But then, a sound drifted toward them, the rumble of a wagon, then another, and another. It was the townspeople. Leading the small procession was the sheriff, followed by the town's carpenter, the stable owner, and farmers whose wagons Caleb had fixed. They came bearing not pity, but tools and lumber. They came with sacks of flour and salted meat. The stable owner walked up to Caleb and placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Thorne thought he could burn you out," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But you too, you're part of this town now. You're the best part of it." The carpenter began organizing the men, his voice booming as he directed them to clear the debris. The women of the town surrounded Leanne, bringing her a blanket and a hot cup of coffee, speaking to her not as a cripple, but as a respected neighbor. That afternoon, the stable owner and two other merchants went to the sheriff's office and gave sworn testimony, describing Thorne's long history of threats and intimidation. It was the final proof the sheriff needed. He rode to Thorne's opulent house and arrested him in front of his stunned household staff. The fire, meant to be a final, crushing blow, had instead become a beacon, galvanizing the community and burning away the last vestiges of fear and prejudice that Thorne had cultivated for so long. 1 year later, where the ashes of the old forge had once lain, stood the Phoenix Forge and Supply, a business twice the size of the original, its new sign carved from proud oak. It was the undisputed center of the town's commerce, a hub of trade and craftsmanship. Caleb, his shoulders now broad with a quiet confidence, was no longer defined by a single moment of fear, but by years of hard work, integrity, and the courage he had found in his duty to protect his home. Men now sought his counsel, respecting the steady wisdom in his eyes and the skill in his hands. He was a builder in every sense of the word. Lian presided over this small empire from a custom-built